The sound of laughter echoed through the restaurant, but it wasn't the kind that warms your heart. It was sharp, cruel, like the clinking of cold silverware against porcelain. Margaret sat at the long table surrounded by her family, her son Daniel, his wife Melissa, and their teenage daughter Sophie. It was supposed to be a celebration, her 65th birthday. The candles flickered beautifully atop the white linen tablecloth, but she could feel every pair of eyes judging her instead of celebrating her. Melissa leaned closer, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Oh, Mother, that dress. Did you get it from the thrift store again? It's so vintage." Sophie giggled behind her phone, snapping a photo for her friends. Daniel didn't even look up. He just chuckled softly and said, "Come on, Mom. You know Melissa's just kidding." Margaret forced a smile. "Of course," she murmured, pretending to straighten the sequins on her faded blue dress, the same dress she'd worn to her late husband's retirement party 20 years ago. She had worn it tonight because it made her feel close to him again, because he would have told her she looked beautiful, no matter what. But no one at the table cared to remember that. The waiter refilled their glasses with sparkling water, and Margaret caught his eye for a brief second. He smiled at her, a kind smile, the only one she'd received that evening. It was enough to keep her from crying right there. When the birthday cake finally arrived, a large white-frosted masterpiece with pink roses, the room went quiet. Then came the chorus, "Happy birthday to you." Their voices were cheerful, almost exaggerated. Margaret clapped her hands together, smiling softly. She leaned forward to blow out the candles, and just before she did, she whispered under her breath, "I hope they finally see me." As the smoke curled upward, Melissa clapped her hands. "Make a wish, Mother. Maybe next year, a new wardrobe." The table erupted in laughter again. Margaret felt her heart twist. Then the waiter cleared his throat. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently, holding up a small folded note that had fallen from the side of the cake. This was inside the cake. It seems important. The laughter stopped. All eyes turned to him. The waiter unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. The waiter's voice trembled slightly as he unfolded the note. The entire table fell silent. The hum of the restaurant faded into nothing. All that remained was the faint hiss of candle smoke and the sound of Margaret's shallow breathing. He cleared his throat and began to read. "To my family, if you're hearing this, it means you've once again gathered for my birthday, pretending everything is fine. But tonight, I don't want smiles of pity or laughter at my expense. I want truth." Melissa's smirk froze. Sophie lowered her phone. Even Daniel, who had been scrolling through messages, looked up frowning. The waiter continued, his voice steady now. "For years, I've watched you turn every moment of my life into a joke. You forgot the woman who gave you everything, her time, her savings, her love. But love, when mocked, becomes something else. Tonight, I wanted you to remember what it feels like to be seen." Daniel's face flushed. "What is this? Some kind of prank?" he muttered under his breath. The waiter ignored him and kept reading. "I've already made my choice. Everything I own, my home, my savings, the last pieces of what your father and I built together, will go to the one person who showed me kindness when my own family couldn't." A murmur spread across the table. Melissa's fork clattered against her plate. "What? What kind of sick joke is this?" But the waiter wasn't done. "You will soon learn that love isn't inherited by blood. It's earned through compassion." He folded the letter back up and handed it to Margaret, whose trembling fingers brushed against the paper as if it were something sacred. No one spoke for a long time. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Daniel stood, his voice tight. "Mom, what's going on? Did you write this?" Margaret looked up at her son, her only son, and for the first time in years, she didn't try to soften her voice. "Yes, Daniel, every word." The waiter stepped back, unsure if he should leave, but Margaret gave him a small nod, a silent thank you. Across the table, Melissa muttered something under her breath, her face pale. Sophie just stared, eyes wide, the laughter completely gone from her. Margaret picked up her glass, her hand no longer shaking. "Let's finish dinner," she said quietly. "It might be the last meal we ever share like this." No one touched their plates, and in that heavy silence, beneath the dim restaurant lights, Margaret finally felt something she hadn't in years: power. That night, long after everyone had left the restaurant, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table. The note, now slightly stained with cake frosting, lay in front of her like a confession she could never take back. The silence of her small apartment wrapped around her like an old blanket, familiar but cold. She traced the rim of her teacup with one finger and closed her eyes. For a moment she could still hear her husband's laugh echoing through this very kitchen. Arthur. He used to tell her that family was the only thing that truly mattered. "You build a home, you raise them right, and they'll take care of you when you're old," he would say, his voice filled with quiet confidence. She had believed him. She had believed every word. But Arthur had been gone for almost 20 years now, and with him went the warmth that once held their family together. When he died, Daniel was in debt, a failed business, a mountain of credit cards, and a wife with expensive tastes. Margaret had stepped in without hesitation. She sold the small hardware store she and Arthur had built from scratch and handed the money to her son. She told herself it was what any mother would do. At the time, Melissa had cried tears of gratitude. "You're saving our family," she had said, hugging Margaret tightly. But as the years passed, that gratitude turned into entitlement. The hugs stopped. The visits grew shorter. The phone calls became rare. Margaret learned to read between the lines of their politeness. The way Melissa's eyes darted around her modest apartment, the way Daniel always looked at his watch when she talked about the past. They weren't listening anymore. They were waiting for her to stop talking. And when her birthday came around each year, it became less about love and more about obligation. "We'll take you somewhere nice," Daniel would say. "Just don't make it awkward." She remembered one year when she had baked her own cake, a simple chocolate one, like she used to make for Arthur. Melissa had laughed then, too. "Mom, next year let's leave the baking to people who know what they're doing, okay?" That night, Margaret cried quietly in her room, not because of the cake, but because no one even remembered it was Arthur's favorite. Now, sitting under the dim kitchen light, she realized something. Love, when given endlessly and never returned, begins to rot. That's when she began to plan. It wasn't revenge she wanted. It was recognition. A moment when her family would finally look at her and see more than a burden, more than a wallet, more than an old woman who dressed out of style. So when her old friend Henry, the owner of the restaurant, offered to host her birthday dinner, an idea took root, a quiet, deliberate idea. And the note inside the cake was only the beginning. Emily had always been different from her brother. Where Daniel was loud, proud, and impatient to prove himself, Emily was gentle, a quiet soul who painted in the garden and laughed at her father's silly jokes. She used to braid Margaret's hair every Sunday morning before church, humming softly, her fingers light and careful. But when Arthur died, something inside their family cracked in a way that could never be repaired. Daniel buried himself in business deals. Melissa focused on keeping up appearances. Emily, she tried to hold everyone together, but Margaret, blinded by grief, didn't see her pain. There was one night Margaret would never forget. Emily had come home late from her job at the art gallery, exhausted but smiling. She'd brought dinner, take-out Chinese food, and placed it on the table. "Mom," she'd said gently, "I think we should sell the house. It's too big for you alone, and maybe we could start fresh somewhere smaller, together." But Margaret, already stretched thin, had snapped. "This house was your father's pride. How dare you talk about selling it?" The words cut deeper than she realized. Emily didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes glossy. That night, she quietly packed her things and moved out. Margaret thought it was temporary. She told herself Emily would come back after a week or two. But months passed, and then years. The phone calls became fewer. The last time they spoke, Emily said she'd met someone, a kind man, and that she was happy. Margaret had tried to sound supportive, but jealousy crept into her heart. How could her daughter be happy without her? After that, silence. Daniel used to tease her, saying, "You spoiled her too much, Mom. She'll come crawling back when she realizes the world isn't so soft." But Emily never did. When the letter from the hospital arrived, a short, cold note confirming Emily's death after a car accident, Margaret's world stopped spinning. There was no funeral she could attend, no goodbye. The letter said, "Next of kin unknown." That phrase haunted her every night. She would wake up at 3 a.m., replaying every word she never said. "I'm sorry. I love you. Please come home." Sometimes, in her dreams, she would see Emily again, standing in the garden, smiling, holding a small child by the hand, a boy with her eyes. But every time Margaret reached out, the image faded. That's when the guilt became unbearable. She began visiting the restaurant where Henry, her late husband's old friend, still worked. He would pour her coffee and listen as she talked about Emily, about how she wished she could undo everything. Henry would smile softly and say, "It's never too late to be kind, Margaret. Life has strange ways of giving us second chances." At the time, she didn't understand what he meant, but soon she would. The first time Margaret met Tom, it was raining. She had slipped on the wet pavement outside Henry's restaurant, the grocery bags scattering across the sidewalk. No one stopped to help, except a boy in a waiter's uniform. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he'd asked, kneeling beside her. His hair was soaked, his voice soft but urgent. He helped her to her feet, gathered her apples, even wiped the mud from her sleeve with a napkin. She remembered thinking how absurd it was, a stranger showing more concern than her own family ever did. After that day, every Thursday afternoon, Margaret would visit the restaurant. She told herself it was for the soup. Henry made the best tomato bisque in town. But really, it was because Tom always smiled when he saw her. "Your usual table, Mrs. Harlow?" he'd ask, cheerful and respectful. She liked the way he said her name, as if it still mattered. Over time, they talked. Not about anything grand, just the small details that make up a life. The weather, the smell of bread baking, his dreams of saving money for college. He reminded her of Emily, that same quiet kindness, that same soft humor that made the world seem gentler. One evening, when she left her purse behind by accident, Tom ran after her in the rain to return it. "Can't lose something this important," he'd said, smiling shyly. Inside the purse was a photo of Arthur and the children, taken on Emily's 10th birthday. Margaret noticed his eyes linger on the photo for a moment longer than usual, but she thought nothing of it. Weeks turned into months. She found herself baking cookies for him on holidays, leaving small notes of encouragement tucked inside the tip envelope. "Thank you for treating me like a person, not a burden." He never mentioned the notes, but he always smiled when he read them. One afternoon, Tom told her that Henry, her old friend, had been helping him with college paperwork. "He says you've been through a lot," Tom said quietly. "You're strong." Margaret had laughed bitterly. "Strong, maybe, but I'm also tired." He nodded, understanding far beyond his years. Sometimes being kind is the hardest kind of strength. That line stayed with her. So when Henry suggested throwing her a birthday dinner at his restaurant, it felt like a way to celebrate one last time, to feel surrounded by life, not pity. Margaret agreed, but secretly she had one more plan, one final gesture to reclaim her dignity. She wrote the note and handed it to Henry in an envelope, asking him to hide it inside the cake before it was brought to the table. Henry raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. "You sure about this?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes. If they won't listen when I speak, maybe they'll listen when I'm silent." What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that both Henry and Tom were keeping a secret of their own, a secret that would change everything. The next morning, the house felt heavier than usual. Margaret had barely slept. The note from the cake, now wrinkled and sugar-stained, lay on the coffee table. The silence of her living room was interrupted only by the faint ticking of the clock, marking each second since she had finally told the truth. When the knock came at her door, she already knew who it was. Daniel didn't even wait for her to answer. He pushed the door open, Melissa right behind him. Both of them still dressed from the night before. Melissa's makeup smudged, Daniel's eyes red from anger. "What the hell was that, Mom?" he demanded. "You humiliated us in front of everyone." Margaret's voice was calm, almost too calm. "I told the truth." "The truth?" Melissa snapped. "You made it sound like we're monsters, like we've neglected you." Margaret turned to her daughter-in-law slowly. "You laughed at me, Melissa, on my birthday. You mocked my dress, my age, even my memories. That's not love." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "You can't just threaten to give away your money because of a bad joke. That's not how families work." She looked at him sadly. "Then tell me, Daniel, how does family work?" He froze, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. Melissa folded her arms. "So what now? You're leaving everything to that waiter boy? You don't even know him." Margaret's tone sharpened for the first time. "I know kindness when I see it, and that boy has shown me more respect than my own family in years." Daniel slammed his hand against the table. "You're losing it, Mom. This isn't normal." But Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up the note from the coffee table and smoothed it out. "Do you even know what normal used to be? Your father used to bring me flowers every week. You kids would make handmade cards. Now you can't even say happy birthday without checking your phones first." Melissa rolled her eyes. "Oh, please stop romanticizing the past. The world's different now." Margaret gave a weary smile. "No, Melissa. People are different. Hearts are colder." The tension crackled like static. Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but Melissa grabbed his arm. "Let's go," she hissed. "We're not getting anywhere with her." As they stormed out, the door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Margaret's gaze drifted to one of them, a photograph of her family taken years ago. All of them were smiling then. She reached out and touched Daniel's face in the picture, whispering softly, "You used to laugh with me, not at me." Then she turned away, and for the first time she felt something shifting inside her. Not anger, not even sadness, resolve. 2 days after the confrontation, Margaret returned to the restaurant. The lunch crowd had thinned out, and soft jazz played in the background. Tom noticed her immediately and hurried over. "Mrs. Harlow, you're back," he said with that warm smile she had come to rely on. "Rough week?" Margaret gave a tired chuckle. "You could say that." He led her to her favorite corner table, the one near the window where sunlight spilled like honey across the tablecloth. She sat down slowly, her hands still trembling slightly. "I didn't expect my family to react the way they did." Tom hesitated. People don't like facing the truth, especially when it comes from someone they take for granted. His words hit her deeper than he knew. Over the next hour they talked, about simple things mostly. How he'd been saving up for college, how his foster father, Henry, had taught him to cook. But then Margaret noticed something in his tone, that quiet empathy that made her chest ache. "You remind me of someone," she said softly. "My daughter, Emily." Tom smiled gently. "You've told me about her before. She sounded kind." "She was," Margaret whispered. "Too kind for this world." He nodded, eyes lowering. "Kind people usually are." She studied him for a long moment, the curve of his jaw, the way he avoided eye contact when emotions got heavy. Something about him always felt strangely familiar, like a melody she couldn't place, but had heard somewhere before. Before she could say anything more, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Mom?" Margaret turned. Melissa stood by the entrance, one manicured hand clutching her purse, eyes wide with disbelief. "Melissa," Margaret said, trying to steady her voice, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." Melissa's gaze darted to Tom, then back to her mother-in-law. "Having lunch with the waiter now? Is this where all your inheritance money is going?" Tom straightened, jaw tightening. "Ma'am, that's not—" But Margaret raised her hand. "That's enough." Her tone was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that silenced them both. She stood slowly, facing Melissa. "You think kindness is something to be suspicious of, don't you? That everyone's after your money, your comfort, your image." Melissa blinked, caught off guard. Margaret continued, voice calm but firm. "Not everyone wants something from you, Melissa. Some people just want to give." For a second, Melissa's expression faltered, but the softness vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You've lost it, Margaret. You're being played." She turned and stormed out, heels clicking against the marble floor. Tom exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harlow. I didn't mean to make things worse." Margaret smiled faintly. "You didn't, Tom. You just helped me see them more clearly." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Margaret gazed out the window, feeling the first real stirrings of peace. The calm before the storm she knew was still coming. The following weekend, Margaret stayed home. She spent her morning watering the small row of violets by her window, flowers Emily had once loved. The quiet gave her peace until the sudden sound of car doors slamming shattered it. Through the lace curtains, she saw Daniel and Melissa striding up the path, both with that look, not of concern, but of determination. She sighed, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. When she opened the door, Daniel didn't even wait for her to speak. "We need to talk," he said flatly. "Come in," she replied, voice calm. Melissa glanced around the living room as they entered, her gaze flicking over the simple furniture, the framed photos, the faint smell of old books. "You know, Daniel," she said under her breath, "I still can't believe she's giving everything away, to a stranger, no less." Margaret poured tea, her movements slow and deliberate. "He's not a stranger," she said. "He's a friend." Daniel folded his arms. "A friend? Mom, this is insane. You've known him for what, a few months? You don't just give your life savings to some kid you met at a restaurant." Margaret looked up, meeting his eyes. "I gave my life savings to you once, remember?" The words hit him like a slap. For a moment, Daniel's confident expression cracked. "That was different. I needed help." "And I gave it," she said softly, "without question, without conditions." Melissa set her teacup down a little too hard. "So what is this then? Payback? You want to punish us for not being perfect?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't want to punish anyone. I just want to leave what I have to someone who made me feel seen." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "You're talking nonsense. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Melissa and I talked about it. Maybe it's time someone helped you manage things. A power of attorney, maybe?" Margaret froze, then laughed quietly, a sound that made them both uneasy. "You mean take control of what's left of my life?" Melissa smiled thinly. "It's for your own good." For your own good. She'd heard those words before, from doctors, from family, from well-meaning strangers who thought they knew what was best for her. Margaret placed her cup down, her voice steady. "No. What's for my own good is learning when to stop letting people decide that for me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," she said, "but for once, it will be my mistake." They left in silence, frustration simmering beneath the surface. As their car pulled away, Margaret watched through the window, her reflection overlapping with the ghost of her younger self in the glass, strong, lonely, but unyielding. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. The storm had only just begun. It had only been 3 days since their last visit when Daniel showed up again. This time, without warning. The doorbell rang sharply, over and over, until Margaret opened the door. "Daniel," she said, surprised. "It's early." He brushed past her into the house, face pale with anger. "Don't act surprised, Mom. I just came from the lawyer's office." Her heart skipped. "The lawyer?" "Yes," he snapped. "I had to check something. I called Mr. Turner. You remember him, right? He handled Dad's will. Well, imagine my surprise when he said you drew up a new one last week." Margaret's voice stayed calm, though her hands trembled slightly. "That's right." Daniel stared at her, disbelief and fury mixing on his face. "Why? Why now? And why him?" "Him?" she asked quietly. "You know damn well who I mean," Daniel hissed. "That boy from the restaurant, Tom, or whatever his name is. You've barely known him for a year and you're leaving him everything?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "Not everything, just what matters." Melissa appeared in the doorway, holding her phone, her expression cold and tight. "You really did it," she said. "You changed the will. Daniel told me, but I didn't believe him. You've lost your mind, Margaret." "No," Margaret replied softly. "I finally found it." Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "Do you have any idea how this looks? You think people won't talk? They'll think he's taking advantage of you." Margaret met his glare with steady eyes. "Let them talk. They already talk. About my clothes, my house, my age. At least now, they'll talk about something that matters." Melissa crossed her arms. "You're being manipulated. You're old and lonely, and that kid is playing you like a fool." Something inside Margaret snapped. Her voice didn't rise, but every word cut clean and sharp. "You think kindness is manipulation because you've forgotten what it feels like to receive it. You can't imagine someone helping another person without expecting something in return." Daniel rubbed his temples, muttering, "This is insane." But Margaret wasn't finished. "Do you remember when your father got sick? When we stayed up all night taking turns with his medication? He always said love is proven in quiet actions, not in grand words or expensive gifts." Her eyes softened. "Tom reminds me of that, of the kind of love this family has forgotten." For a moment, Daniel's face twitched, not with anger, but something else, fear, because beneath all his indignation, he knew there was truth in her words. Melissa looked at him sharply. "We can contest it. She's not thinking straight." Margaret smiled faintly. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years." Outside, the wind began to howl through the trees. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke, raindrops splattering against the windows. Daniel turned toward the door, jaw tight. "This isn't over, Mom. Not by a long shot." Margaret watched him go, the sound of thunder echoing behind him. And though her heart trembled, she didn't regret a thing. The rain didn't stop for 2 days. Margaret spent most of that time inside, curled up on her old armchair, the steady drumming on the window keeping her company. She thought about Daniel's face, the disbelief, the anger, and the fear, fear that he might have to face a version of his mother he could no longer control. On the third morning, her phone rang. Unknown number. "Mrs. Harlow?" a polite voice asked. "This is James from the estate office. Just a courtesy call. Your son came by again today. He requested a copy of your new will." Margaret felt a chill crawl up her spine. "And did you give it to him?" "No, ma'am, it's confidential. But he seemed rather upset." She thanked the man and hung up. Her hands were shaking again. So they weren't done. Not by a long shot. That evening, she decided to go back to the restaurant, to talk to Henry, to make sure she hadn't put Tom in danger by involving him in her personal mess. When she walked in, the place was quiet, closing soon. Henry looked up from the counter, wiping a glass. "You shouldn't be out in this weather, Margaret." "I needed to see you," she said softly. "Daniel went to the lawyer. He's furious." Henry sighed, setting the glass down. "I figured he would be." "Did I do the right thing?" she asked, voice trembling. "Leaving everything to Tom?" Henry looked at her for a long time, eyes full of something that almost looked like guilt. "You did what felt right to you. That's all that matters." But there was something in his tone, a weight, that made her uneasy. Before she could ask more, Tom appeared from the kitchen, still in his apron, smiling when he saw her. "Mrs. Harlow, you're here." "I wanted to check on you," she said. "I might have dragged you into something messy." Tom shook his head. "You didn't. Henry told me what happened. I want you to know, whatever they say about me, I'd never hurt you." Margaret smiled faintly. "I know, dear." But even as she said it, her eyes flickered between him and Henry, and she noticed for the first time the way Henry's gaze softened when Tom spoke, like there was more between them than an employer and a young waiter. Later that night, back home, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out into the dark street, the reflection of her lamp shimmering on the glass. In her mind, a thought began to take shape, vague but persistent. What if Henry wasn't just being kind? What if he and Tom knew something she didn't? Across town, in Daniel and Melissa's house, another storm was brewing. Melissa sat at her computer, scrolling through social media until she found the restaurant's page. "There," she said, pointing to a photo. "That's him, Tom. Let's see who this kind young man really is." Daniel leaned over her shoulder, and as the lightning flashed across the room, the look in his eyes turned cold. It was late afternoon when Henry's restaurant door swung open hard enough to make the bell above it jingle violently. Tom looked up from wiping the counter and froze. Daniel and Melissa stood there, drenched from the rain, but burning with purpose. Henry stepped out from the kitchen, frowning. "We're closed." Daniel ignored him. "I'm not here to eat. I just want to talk to your employee." Tom straightened, his face calm but wary. "Mr. Harlow, right?" Daniel's lips twisted. "So you do know who I am." Melissa took a step forward, her voice sharp. "We've done some digging. You and Henry have quite the little setup here, don't you? Cozy dinners, secret letters, and now, surprise, my mother-in-law's entire estate under your name." Henry's eyes darkened. "That's enough." But Daniel wasn't done. "What are you really after, kid? You think this is some charity act? You earn her trust, let her rewrite the will, and then what? Vanish with her money?" Tom's jaw tightened. "You have no right to talk to me like that." "I have every right," Daniel snapped. "She's my mother." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock above the door and the patter of rain outside. Then Henry spoke, his voice low but firm. "Tom has never asked your mother for a thing. He's worked here since he was 16. He's earned every dollar he's made." Melissa scoffed. "Oh, please. You expect us to believe this isn't manipulation? That an old woman just decided to give away everything because he smiled at her?" Tom looked at her directly, his voice shaking but steady. "Maybe because no one else did." That shut her up for a second. Daniel's tone softened, but only slightly. "Listen, if this is about sympathy, fine. She's lonely. I get that. But this inheritance thing, it has to stop. She's not well." Henry's eyes flashed. "Don't you dare call your mother unwell just because she finally stood up to you." Melissa crossed her arms. "Funny. You're awfully defensive for someone who's not getting anything out of this." Henry took a step closer. "Watch your mouth." The tension was thick enough to choke on. Tom finally spoke, his voice low but trembling with something deeper, anger, maybe hurt. "You don't know her. You don't even see her. Every time she comes in here, she talks about how she misses being loved, how her own family stopped visiting unless they needed something. Maybe she deserves to give her love to someone who actually cares." Daniel's expression faltered, just for a moment, but Melissa grabbed his arm. "Let's go. This is pointless." As they turned to leave, Henry called out, "Daniel." Daniel stopped at the door. Henry's voice softened. "You might want to look a little closer before accusing anyone. Sometimes family isn't as far from you as you think." Daniel frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Henry only said, "Ask your sister." Daniel froze. "My sister's dead." Henry looked away. "Are you sure?" The words hung in the air like thunder, sharp and impossible to ignore. Daniel couldn't shake Henry's words. They echoed in his head all the way home. "Are you sure?" He tried to tell himself it was just a mind game, some manipulative trick to make him question reality, but deep down, something in Henry's tone, the quiet certainty, the almost sorrowful edge, refused to let him rest. That night, Daniel sat in his study with a drink in hand, scrolling through old files on his laptop. Photos, bank statements, copies of old letters their mother had kept. He had always avoided those folders. They were reminders of a sister he preferred to forget. Emily, the one who could do no wrong, the one who had always made him feel like he wasn't enough. Melissa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're still thinking about what that old man said?" Daniel didn't look up. "Something's off, Mel." Henry knew something. He wouldn't have said that otherwise. Melissa rolled her eyes. "Emily's been dead for years, Daniel. You saw the letter." He rubbed his forehead. "A letter. That's all we ever had. No funeral, no photos, no proof. Just a few words on paper." Melissa sighed impatiently. "So what? You think she's been hiding all this time? That she's, what, working at that restaurant too?" He didn't answer. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Listen to me. Your mother is being manipulated, and now you're letting them get into your head too. You're better than this." Daniel stood abruptly, walking to the bookshelf. "You remember Mom's storage boxes? From Dad's study. Melissa frowned. The ones in the attic? Yeah. They went upstairs, dust swirling in the beam of the flashlight. Daniel knelt beside an old trunk, the metal latch cold against his fingers. When he opened it, the faint scent of cedar and thyme washed over him. Inside were stacks of papers, photographs, and a small wooden box. He lifted the lid and froze. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Emily, all unopened. Melissa leaned in. "What the hell is this?" Daniel picked one up, his fingers trembling. The handwriting was familiar. Henry's. "Emily, he's safe. He looks just like you. I'll keep my promise." The blood drained from Daniel's face. He tore open another envelope. "He's growing fast. You'd be proud. I'll make sure your mother never forgets you, even if she never knows." Melissa's voice cracked. "Who's he?" Daniel didn't answer. His mind was already racing. Henry's words, Tom's face, Emily's smile. They began to blur together in a way that made too much sense, and yet felt impossible. Finally, he whispered, "Oh my God." Melissa grabbed his arm. "What?" Daniel looked up at her, pale as the moonlight spilling through the attic window. "Tom," he said hoarsely, "he's not just some waiter. He's Emily's son." Melissa staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. That's insane." But Daniel could barely hear her. The truth was unraveling too fast to stop. Downstairs, the wind rattled the windows, and somewhere, far across town, Margaret sat in her chair, clutching a photograph of Emily, unaware that the secret she'd buried in grief was about to explode into her living room. The knock on Margaret's door came just after dusk. 3 sharp raps, quick and angry. She had been sitting by the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. When she opened the door, Daniel stood there, soaked in sweat, eyes wide and feverish. "Daniel?" she asked, alarmed. "What's wrong?" He didn't wait for permission. He stormed past her, clutching a small bundle of letters. "You knew," he said, his voice shaking. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Margaret blinked. "Knew what?" He threw the letters onto the table. They spilled open like scattered ghosts. Emily, Henry, that boy, Tom. Her breath caught. "What about them?" Daniel slammed his palm on the table. "He's not just some waiter, Mom. He's Emily's son. Henry's been hiding him all these years." The words hit her like a thunderclap. For a moment, the world tilted. She reached for the back of the chair to steady herself. "No, that can't be." Daniel tore open one of the letters, reading aloud through gritted teeth. "He's safe. He looks just like you. I'll keep my promise." He shoved the paper toward her. "Henry wrote this to Emily after she disappeared. And look at the dates, Mom. These letters are years after she supposedly died." Margaret sank into the chair, the color draining from her face. Her fingers trembled as she touched the faded ink. She could still recognize Henry's handwriting, careful, deliberate. Why would he hide this from me?" she whispered. Daniel's tone softened for the first time in years. "Maybe he thought he was protecting you, or maybe he didn't trust you to handle the truth." Margaret shook her head slowly, disbelief giving way to pain. "Emily had a child?" Daniel nodded. "Tom, it has to be him. Think about it. The age, The way Henry watches over him, the resemblance. You said yourself he reminded you of her." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. Her voice cracked. "He called me Mrs. Harlow all this time. He sat across from me, listened to me talk about her, and he never said a word." Daniel swallowed hard. Maybe he didn't know either. They sat in silence, the weight of revelation pressing down on them. The clock ticked loudly, counting the seconds since Margaret's life had quietly split in two. Finally, she whispered, "I have to see him." Daniel hesitated. "Mom, maybe you should—" "I have to," she said firmly, her old strength returning. "If there's even a chance." Her voice trailed off, but her eyes burned with determination. She grabbed her coat, ignoring Daniel's protests, and stepped out into the night. The wind was cold, the streets slick from earlier rain, but she didn't care. Every step she took was guided by one thought, one fragile, desperate hope. If Tom was truly Emily's son, then maybe, after all these years, she hadn't lost everything. The restaurant was closed when Margaret arrived. The lights inside were dim, only a faint glow spilling from the kitchen. She could see Henry through the window, wiping down a counter, moving slower than usual. Her heart pounded as she knocked. Once, twice, then harder. Henry looked up, startled, and when he saw her, his expression fell, not from surprise, but from understanding. He knew this moment was coming. He opened the door slowly. "Margaret," he said quietly, "it's late." She stepped inside without a word, her eyes glistening. "How long, Henry?" He froze. "How long what?" Her voice trembled. "How long have you known?" She pulled the letters from her coat pocket and dropped them onto the nearest table. They fanned out like old wounds reopening. "How long have you kept my grandson from me?" Henry's shoulders sagged. "So, Daniel found them." Margaret's voice cracked. "You knew? You knew Emily had a child? That she wasn't really gone? And you said nothing?" He looked at her, guilt carved deep into every line of his face. "I was trying to protect him." "From me?" she whispered. Henry hesitated. "From everything. From your family's judgment. From Daniel's temper. From the shame Emily carried after she left." Margaret staggered back as if struck. "Shame? For what?" Henry took a deep breath. "Emily got pregnant after she moved away. The father was a man who left her before she could even tell him. She came to me for help. She was scared, Margaret, terrified you'd never forgive her." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "She thought I'd hate her?" Henry's voice softened. "She adored you, but she knew how proud you were. She couldn't face the disappointment. When she died in that car accident, she made me promise one thing, to keep her son safe." Margaret covered her mouth, her sob catching in her throat. "And you did?" Henry nodded. "I raised him as best I could. I never told him the truth because I didn't want to fill his head with pain he couldn't fix. But the day you two met here, I saw something change in both of you. I thought maybe fate was doing what I couldn't." She gripped the back of a chair for support. "He doesn't know, does he?" Henry shook his head. "No, not yet." Just then, a voice came from the kitchen. "Henry, who's here?" Margaret turned Tom stepped out, wiping his hands on a towel, his eyes bright with surprise. "Mrs. Harlow?" For a moment, she couldn't speak. She just stared, really stared, at him. The familiar curve of his smile, the softness of his gaze. Emily's eyes, Arthur's chin, her lip trembled. "Tom." He frowned. "What's wrong?" Margaret took a step forward, her voice breaking. You're my grandson." Silence fell. The towel slipped from his hands and hit the floor. Tom blinked, shaking his head. "What?" Henry's eyes filled with tears. "It's true, son. She's Emily's mother." Tom's world seemed to tilt, the air leaving his lungs. He looked between them, the woman who'd shown him kindness, the man who'd raised him, and whispered, "All this time, I had a family?" Margaret reached for him, sobbing now. "You always did, sweetheart. You always did." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Margaret and Tom stood frozen in the middle of the empty restaurant, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Her hands trembled as she touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, as if afraid he might vanish. "My Emily," she whispered. "You have her smile." Tom's eyes shimmered. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "Just let me hold you." She pulled him into her arms, and for the first time in decades, Margaret felt whole. The ache in her chest that had lived there since Emily's death began to ease. But the peace didn't last. The restaurant door burst open with a crash, the bell clanging wildly. Daniel's voice sliced through the silence. "I knew it!" Margaret turned, startled. Daniel and Melissa stood at the entrance, drenched from the rain again, faces twisted with betrayal and disbelief. "So it's true," Daniel spat. "You've been hiding this from us, all of you." Henry stepped forward. "Daniel, listen." "Don't you dare," Daniel shouted. "You lied to us, to me. You let my mother believe her daughter was dead, and now this boy comes along and suddenly he's family." Tom's fists clenched. "I didn't know, I swear." "Convenient," Melissa muttered coldly. "First the old lady's money, now her heart. Quite a plan you've got." Margaret's voice cut through the air, sharp and steady. "That's enough, Melissa." Daniel turned to his mother, his anger faltering at the look in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but something fierce and unyielding. "You kept this from me?" he demanded. "Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Because I didn't know. Not until tonight. Henry kept his promise to Emily. He protected her son, my grandson, from a world that would have judged her. From you." Daniel's jaw tightened. "From me?" "Yes," she said quietly, "because I remember the things you said about your sister, how you called her weak, irresponsible, how you never forgave her for leaving." He looked away, his voice breaking. "I was angry. She left us after Dad died. You chose her over me." Margaret stepped closer. "No, Daniel. I lost her because I was too proud to say I loved her, and I'm not making that mistake again." Tom swallowed hard. "I don't want anything from you," he said to Daniel, his tone calm but firm. "I didn't even know who I was. I just wanted to make her smile." Melissa scoffed. "Oh, how touching." Margaret turned to her slowly, her voice trembling but resolute. "You've mocked me enough, Melissa. You can sneer at my dress, my age, my mistakes, but not my family, not anymore." The room fell silent. The rain hammered against the windows like applause from heaven itself. Daniel's expression wavered. He looked between his mother, the boy who looked so hauntingly familiar, and the man who'd kept their secret. For the first time, Daniel had no words. Margaret reached for Tom's hand and held it tightly. Her voice broke, but her eyes were clear. This is what love looks like, Daniel. Not control, not convenience, just forgiveness." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Margaret and Tom stood frozen in the middle of the empty restaurant, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Her hands trembled as she touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, as if afraid he might vanish. "My Emily," she whispered, "you have her smile." Tom's eyes shimmered. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "Just let me hold you." She pulled him into her arms, and for the first time in decades, Margaret felt whole. The ache in her chest that had lived there since Emily's death began to ease. But the peace didn't last. The restaurant door burst open with a crash, the bell clanging wildly. Daniel's voice sliced through the silence. "I knew it!" Margaret turned, startled. Daniel and Melissa stood at the entrance, drenched from the rain again, faces twisted with betrayal and disbelief. "So it's true," Daniel spat. "You've been hiding this from us, all of you!" Henry stepped forward. "Daniel, listen! Don't you dare!" Daniel shouted. "You lied to us, to me. You let my mother believe her daughter was dead, and now this boy comes along and suddenly he's family?" Tom's fists clenched. "I didn't know. I swear." "Convenient," Melissa muttered coldly. "First the old lady's money, now her heart. Quite a plan you've got." Margaret's voice cut through the air, sharp and steady. "That's enough, Melissa." Daniel turned to his mother, his anger faltering at the look in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but something fierce and unyielding. "You kept this from me," he demanded. "Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Because I didn't know. Not until tonight." Henry kept his promise to Emily. He protected her son, my grandson, from a world that would have judged her. From you. Daniel's jaw tightened. "From me?" "Yes," she said quietly, "because I remember the things you said about your sister, how you called her weak, irresponsible, how you never forgave her for leaving." He looked away, his voice breaking. "I was angry. She left us after Dad died. You chose her over me." Margaret stepped closer. "No, Daniel. I lost her because I was too proud to say I loved her, and I'm not making that mistake again." Tom swallowed hard. "I don't want anything from you," he said to Daniel, his tone calm but firm. "I didn't even know who I was. I just wanted to make her smile." Melissa scoffed. "Oh, how touching." Margaret turned to her slowly, her voice trembling but resolute. "You've mocked me enough, Melissa. You can sneer at my dress, my age, my mistakes, but not my family, not anymore." The room fell silent. The rain hammered against the windows like applause from heaven itself. Daniel's expression wavered. He looked between his mother, the boy who looked so hauntingly familiar, and the man who'd kept their secret. For the first time, Daniel had no words. Margaret reached for Tom's hand and held it tightly. Her voice broke, but her eyes were clear. This is what love looks like, Daniel. Not control, not convenience, just forgiveness. The storm had ended by morning, but the silence it left behind was deafening. Sunlight spilled weakly across the wet pavement, catching the glimmer of puddles that reflected a new, fragile peace. Margaret sat by the window of her small home, wrapped in a blanket. The air still smelled faintly of rain, clean, cold, and a little sad. On the table beside her was a photograph Henry had given her that morning, a young Emily holding a baby boy, both smiling at the camera. She ran her fingers over the faded edges, tears threatening again. Henry had stayed the night to make sure she wasn't alone. When she thanked him, his eyes were weary but kind. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "Emily would have wanted this, for you two to find each other." Now, sitting there, Margaret whispered to the photo, "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you, but I'll spend the rest of my days making it right, through him." Across town, Daniel sat alone in his car outside the restaurant, watching through the windshield as Tom helped Henry unload boxes for the morning delivery. He hadn't gone inside. He couldn't. Not yet. He wanted to hate the boy, wanted to see him as the intruder Melissa always claimed he was. But he couldn't. Every time he looked at Tom, he saw his sister, the way she used to stand up for him when he got in trouble, the way she laughed without caring who was watching. He realized how much of that laughter he'd spent a lifetime trying to silence. He sighed, leaning back in his seat. On the passenger side sat a folded envelope, a check for a sum large enough to start over. He'd written Tom's name on it, then crossed it out 3 times. Finally, he whispered, "You don't need my money. You just need me to be better." He didn't drive away, not yet, just sat there, letting the morning light find him. Back inside the restaurant, Tom was cleaning tables when Henry handed him a small, worn box. "Your mother's," Henry said quietly. "She left it with me before she—" Tom opened it slowly. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished with time. Inside the locket, 2 tiny photos, one of a young Emily, one of a newborn wrapped in a blue blanket. On the back, a small engraving, "For Mom, forgive me." His throat tightened. She wanted Grandma to have this. Henry nodded. But she wasn't ready then. Tom's eyes filled with tears. Maybe she is now. He closed the box carefully, holding it to his chest. For years, he'd lived without a name for his past, without knowing who he was. Now he had one: grandson, family, home. And though the pain still lingered, it was the kind that could finally heal. The sun had begun to set when Daniel finally came to her house. Margaret had just finished making tea when she heard the hesitant knock at the door, softer this time, almost apologetic. When she opened it, he stood there with a weary smile and eyes red from sleeplessness. "Hi, Mom." She said nothing at first, just opened the door wider and stepped aside. He walked in slowly, his gaze flickering around the small, quiet space, the same house where he'd once stormed in, shouting, accusing, breaking what little peace she had. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea, the clinking of porcelain the only sound for a long time. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low. "Melissa left." She looked up. "I know." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "You always know." She smiled faintly. Mothers usually do. They sat in silence again, the steam from their cups curling between them like ghosts of words neither knew how to say. "I went to see Tom this morning," Daniel finally said. "He didn't want to talk to me at first. I can't blame him, but I told him I was sorry." Margaret nodded gently. "And?" "He said he forgave me." His voice cracked on the last word. Just like that, no hesitation. "I don't think I've ever been forgiven that easily before." Her eyes softened. "That's because he has Emily's heart." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, exhausted. "I've spent so many years being angry at her, for leaving, for being better than me. I guess I thought if I hated her enough, I wouldn't have to miss her." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "I understand. I did the same thing. I let pride fill the space where love should have been." For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of shared regret hung between them, heavy but no longer suffocating. "I don't deserve her forgiveness," Daniel murmured. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but she'd give it anyway, because that's who she was." He looked at her, eyes glistening. "Do you forgive me?" Margaret's lips trembled. "I already have." Tears finally spilled down his cheeks, silent, unstoppable. He leaned forward, and she gathered him into her arms, just as she had when he was a little boy, shaking after a bad dream. For years she'd wondered if she'd ever feel that closeness again, the simple comfort of holding her son without resentment between them. Now she did. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the kitchen in gold, Margaret whispered, "You still have time to make things right with him, with your nephew." Daniel nodded against her shoulder. "I will. I promise." When he finally left, she watched from the doorway as he disappeared down the street. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and lilac, Emily's favorite flower. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt still, quiet, but not lonely. Margaret looked up at the fading light and whispered to the air, "Thank you, Emily, for bringing us back." A year had passed since that stormy night. The seasons had changed quietly, and so had they. The small restaurant on Maple Street looked different now, brighter, warmer, alive. The once empty corner table near the window was now always reserved. Every Thursday afternoon, Margaret sat there, sipping tea as Tom prepared her favorite soup in the kitchen. It had become their ritual, their bridge between 2 generations that had once lost each other. "Grandma, stop pretending you don't like extra cream," Tom teased, bringing out her bowl. Margaret laughed, a sound lighter than it had been in years. "I'm old, not blind. I know what I like." They shared a smile that spoke more than words could. Sometimes Margaret would glance at him and still feel the pang, the mix of love and regret, knowing how much time they had lost. But she also knew that life, in its strange mercy, had given her another chance. Daniel visited often now. He'd sold his company and moved to a smaller home closer to his mother. "I don't need much anymore," he'd said. "Turns out happiness doesn't require square footage." He and Tom were slowly rebuilding something that looked like family. Awkward at first, but genuine. Sometimes Daniel would help out at the restaurant too, joking that washing dishes was cheaper than therapy. Margaret knew it wasn't just a joke. Henry still managed the restaurant, though his steps had grown slower, his voice gentler. One afternoon he called Margaret and Tom to the back office. On the desk lay a sealed envelope, yellowed around the edges. Henry smiled faintly. "This came from Emily. I kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment." Tom froze. "A letter? From my mom?" Henry nodded. "She wrote it after you were born. Told me to give it to your grandmother if she ever found you." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, in Emily's familiar looping handwriting, were just a few lines, but they pierced through every wall she'd built around her heart. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I just want you to know I never left because I stopped loving you. I left because I was scared of failing you, of disappointing you, but I hope someday my son will bring you back the joy I took with me." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears spilling freely. Tom knelt beside her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Henry's eyes glistened as he said quietly, "Looks like she kept her promise." That night, they stayed at the restaurant long after closing. The city outside was quiet, painted in the gold of streetlights. Margaret sat by the window, watching the reflection of three people who were once strangers, now bound by something deeper than blood: forgiveness. As she looked at Henry, a thought crossed her mind. How much he had sacrificed to protect what she had almost destroyed. She whispered, "Thank you, Henry, for giving me my family back." He smiled, his eyes soft. "It wasn't me, Margaret. It was love. It just needed a little time to find its way home." Winter came softly that year. The streets were quiet under a thin layer of snow, and the restaurant was warm with the smell of cinnamon and roasted apples. It was Margaret's 66th birthday. Tom had decorated the restaurant himself: white candles, small paper stars, and a cake that looked almost identical to the one from a year ago. But this time, there were no mocking smiles, no cruel laughter, only love. Daniel was there too, helping arrange flowers. "You're lucky I didn't burn the place down," he joked. Margaret laughed. "You've improved, slightly." Tom appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour off his hands. "All right, everyone. Grandma, make a wish." Margaret looked around the room, at Daniel, at Tom, at the photos of Henry on the wall, and her eyes filled with tears. Henry had passed away just a month earlier, quietly, peacefully, sitting by the window of his little office. He'd left no wealth, no possessions, only a single letter addressed to her and Tom. That letter had arrived just last week in Henry's careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, I've probably gone to see Emily again. Don't be sad. My life was full. not because of what I had, but because of what I was allowed to witness. Forgiveness. Margaret, you found your way back to love. Tom, you found your name. That's all a man like me could ever hope for. Keep the restaurant alive. Keep the laughter kind. And when the candles burn low, remember, love always finds its way home. They had framed the letter and hung it by the entrance, right beside a picture of Henry smiling behind the counter. Now, as the candles flickered on the birthday cake, Margaret whispered her wish. Let love never come too late for anyone. Tom and Daniel sang softly, off-key but sincere, and when she blew out the candles, a small folded note slipped from beneath the icing, hidden by Tom just for fun. She laughed, shaking her head. You didn't. Tom grinned. Read it, Grandma. She unfolded the paper and read aloud. Happy birthday, Grandma. Thank you for finding me, for choosing love when it would have been easier to stay angry. You didn't just give me a home. You gave me a story. Her voice broke, and Daniel gently placed a hand over hers. He's right, Mom. You gave all of us a second chance. The three of them sat there in the golden glow of the restaurant, the candles burning low, snow falling softly outside. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth sink in. There were still scars, wounds that would never fully fade, but they no longer hurt. They had become reminders of survival, proof that love could bloom even from regret. As the clock struck midnight, Tom raised his glass. To family, the one we lose, the one we find, and the one we build. Margaret smiled, her eyes shining. To love, she whispered, that always comes home. The lights dimmed, laughter filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt timeless. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that love, no matter how late, can still heal, comment 1 to send a blessing to Margaret and Tom, or 0 if you think forgiveness should never come that easily. And don't forget to subscribe for more family stories that will make you cry, smile, and believe in love again.